Before we dive into this epic Norse tale of brotherhood, betrayal, and divine judgment, take a moment to show your support for our channel. Hit that like button if you enjoy stories from the age of Vikings, subscribe for more legendary Norse mythology content, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with our Viking saga enthusiasts around the globe. Now let's journey back to the harsh fjords of the north. The winter winds howled across the rocky shores of Nordheim like the voices of the ancestors themselves, carrying with them the scent of salt, pine, and something darker, the metallic tang of destiny approaching. I am Hjalmar the Chronicler, keeper of this hall's memory, and I have witnessed what no mortal should see, the day the gods themselves descended to judge the sins of men. The great hall of Jarl Thorvald stood like a mountain of timber and stone against the grey sky, its carved dragon heads snarling at the storm clouds that gathered overhead. Within these walls, two princes had grown to manhood, two brothers whose bond had once been stronger than the iron of their blades, but whose hearts had grown as distant as the summer sun from winter's cold embrace. Aldric, the elder by 3 winters, possessed the bearing of a natural king. His shoulders were broad as a ship's beam, his golden hair braided with silver rings that caught the firelight as he moved through the hall. When he spoke, men listened. When he laughed, the very rafters seemed to shake with joy. The people loved him as they loved the warmth of spring after the bitter months of ice and darkness. His blue eyes held the wisdom of one who had sailed beyond the known waters and returned with tales that would fill a skald's lifetime. But Valdric, the younger brother, burned with a different fire. Where Aldric was steady as the oak, Valdric was swift as the wolf. His dark hair fell loose about his shoulders, and his green eyes held depths that shifted like the sea in storm. The warriors respected his skill with blade and axe, for none could match his speed in battle. Yet there was something in his gaze, a hunger that grew stronger with each passing season, like a flame that feeds upon itself until it consumes all in its path. Their father, Jarl Thorvald the Iron-Handed, had ruled these lands for 40 winters, his longships bringing wealth from raids across the Whale Road. His hall was filled with treasures, Byzantine silks, Frankish silver, Irish gold, and weapons forged by the finest smiths from lands whose names were whispered like prayers. But of all his treasures, none were more precious to him than his sons, until the day the Norns began weaving the final threads of his fate. The sickness came with the changing of the seasons, as silent as fog rolling in from the sea. It began as a cough, nothing more than what any warrior might suffer after a cold night's watch. But this malady had claws that dug deep into the Jarl's chest, growing stronger while his body grew weaker. The healers came with their herbs and charms, the seeresses with their runes and sacrifices, but the gods had already spoken their judgment. On the night when the aurora danced green and gold across the northern sky, a sign, the wise women said, that the Valkyries rode close to Midgard, Jarl Thorvald called his sons to his side. The great hall fell silent as death itself, save for the crackling of the central fire and the labored breathing of the dying king. "My sons," Thorvald's voice was but a whisper of its former thunder, "the time has come for me to join the Einherjar in Odin's hall. But before I cross the Rainbow Bridge, I must speak of the future of our people." Aldric knelt beside his father's bed, his hand gentle upon the old man's fevered brow. "Father, save your strength. The sickness will pass, as it has before." But Thorvald's eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, fixed upon his elder son with the intensity of a hunting hawk. "No, my boy. The Norns have shown me the thread of my fate, and it grows thin. Listen well, both of you, for these words I will speak only once." Valdric moved closer, his hand instinctively resting upon the pommel of his sword, a gesture that spoke of the warrior's nature that could not be set aside, even in this solemn moment. "The kingdom must pass to one who can unite our people," Thorvald continued, each word an effort that cost him dearly. The Danes grow bold to the south, the Swedes eye our trade routes with envy, and whispers speak of Christian kings across the sea who would see our sacred groves burned and our gods forgotten. The firelight cast dancing shadows across the carved pillars of the hall, where images of Thor's hammer, Odin's ravens, and Freya's boar seemed to writhe and move in the flickering light. Outside, the wind had grown to a howl that spoke of storms to come. Storms not just of weather, but of fate itself. Aldrich, the dying Jarl's voice grew stronger for a moment, as if the gods granted him this final burst of clarity. You have shown wisdom beyond your years. The merchants trust your word. The Jarls of neighboring lands respect your judgment. And our people look to you as they would look to the rising sun. The crown and kingdom are yours by right of birth, but more importantly, by right of character. I saw Valdric's jaw tighten, his knuckles white where they gripped his sword hilt. The younger prince had always lived in his brother's shadow, always been the second son, the spare heir, the one whose deeds were measured against his brother's accomplishments. But in that moment, I glimpsed something darker in his expression, a pain that had festered like a wound left untended. "Father," Valdric's voice was carefully controlled, but those who knew him well could hear the storm beneath the calm. "What of the old ways? What of the trial by combat that our ancestors used to determine the strongest ruler? Aldrich may have the merchant's favor, but can he lead warriors into battle? Can he inspire men to die for more than profit and comfort?" Thorvald's eyes shifted to his younger son, and for a moment, sadness clouded his features. "Valdric, my fierce wolf, your courage is beyond question. You have proven yourself in countless battles, and your name is spoken with respect from the fjords of Norge to the forests of the Russ. But a king needs more than a strong sword arm. He needs the wisdom to know when not to fight, the patience to build alliances, the vision to see beyond the next raid to the prosperity of generations yet unborn. The words hit Valdric like physical blows, and I watched as years of resentment crystallized into something harder and more dangerous. Here was a warrior who had bled for his people, who had sailed into unknown waters and returned with victory, who had never shown his back to an enemy, and yet he was deemed unfit to rule the very people he had fought to protect. "My sons," Thorvald continued, unaware of the poison his words had released into his younger son's heart, "swear to me now, on your honor as warriors and your blood as my heirs, that you will stand together. Swear that no matter what trials come, the bond between you will remain unbroken. The kingdom's strength lies not in any one man, but in the unity of its leaders." Aldrich placed his hand over his heart, his voice ringing clear and true. "I swear, Father, by Thor's hammer and Odin's spear, that I will rule justly and protect our people. And I swear by the bond of blood we share, that my brother will always stand at my right hand, honored and respected as my closest advisor and most trusted war chief." All eyes turned to Valdric, waiting for his oath. The hall was so quiet that the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves could be heard clearly. The younger prince looked at his father, then at his brother, and finally at the assembled lords and warriors who would soon call Aldrich their king. "I swear," Valdric said at last, his voice steady but somehow hollow, "to honor the will of the gods and the judgment of my father." It was not the oath they had expected, not the wholehearted pledge of brotherhood that Thorvald had sought. But the dying Jarl was too weak to demand more, and perhaps he hoped that time would heal whatever wounds his words had opened. 3 days later, as the first snows of winter began to fall, Jarl Thorvald the Iron-Handed breathed his last. The funeral preparations began immediately. A ship was dragged from the harbor to the highest hill overlooking the fjord, filled with the Jarl's weapons, treasures, and personal belongings. His favorite horse and hunting hounds were sacrificed to accompany him on his journey to Valhalla, and a thrall volunteer was chosen to serve him in the afterlife. The funeral pyre burned for 3 days and 3 nights, visible from every farm and village in the kingdom. The smoke rose straight up into the still air, carrying the Jarl's spirit to join the honored dead in Odin's hall. Skalds sang of his deeds, warriors poured mead upon the ground in his honor, and the women keened the ancient songs of mourning that had echoed across these hills since time beyond memory. But even as they honored their fallen lord, whispers began to spread through the kingdom like smoke from the funeral pyre. Some spoke of Aldric's wisdom and just nature, praising the dying Jarl's choice. Others, particularly among the younger warriors and the ambitious Jarls of distant settlements, began to question whether strength of arm might not be more important than cleverness, with words in the dark times that were surely coming. Valdric said little during those days of mourning, but I noticed how his eyes followed his brother, how his hand never strayed far from his weapons, how he stood apart from the crowds that gathered around the new king. He spent long hours walking the cliffs above the sea, staring out at the horizon as if seeking answers in the endless grey waters. On the night before Aldric's formal coronation, as the hall filled with visiting Jarls and their retinues who had come to swear fealty to the new king, Valdric approached his brother. The two princes stood before the central fire, surrounded by the warmth and light of their father's hall, yet somehow isolated from all around them by the weight of unspoken grievances. "Brother," Valdric said, his voice carefully neutral, "tomorrow you will take the crown that was our father's, and his father's before him. The people will kneel before you and call you king." Aldric nodded, his expression grave with the responsibility that weighed upon his shoulders. "It is not a burden I sought, Valdric, but one I will bear as faithfully as our ancestors bore it before me. And I meant what I said to our father. You will stand at my right hand. Together, we will make this kingdom stronger than it has ever been." "Together," Valdric repeated, but the word carried no warmth, no joy, only a bitter acknowledgement of reality. "Tell me, brother, do you believe our father made the right choice? Do you truly think the kingdom is better served by a king who prefers negotiation to conquest, trade to glory?" The question hung in the air between them like the blade of an executioner's axe. Aldrich studied his brother's face, perhaps finally recognizing the depth of resentment that had taken root in Valdric's heart. "I believe," Aldrich said carefully, "that our people have seen enough of glory purchased with their blood. The old days of constant raiding and warfare brought wealth to our hall, yes, but at what cost? How many mothers have mourned sons who will never return from distant shores? How many fields lie fallow because their workers sleep beneath foreign soil? And yet," Valdric's voice grew heated, "it was that same blood and sacrifice that built this kingdom. Our grandfather carved these lands from the wilderness with axe and sword. Our father expanded our territory through strength and courage. Now you speak of making us merchants and farmers, content to count silver rather than win glory." Glory. Aldric's own temper began to rise, perhaps inflamed by days of stress and sleepless nights spent wrestling with the weight of kingship. "What glory is there in needless death? What honor in leaving widows and orphans behind? A true king's glory comes from the prosperity of his people, not from the height of his funeral pyre." The brothers faced each other across the fire, their shadows dancing on the carved walls like the spirits of ancient warriors. Around them, the hall continued its celebration, but those nearest had begun to take notice of the tension between the princes. "You sound like a Christian monk," Valdric said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Where is the warrior who fought beside me against the Danish raiders 5 summers past? Where is the Viking who stood shield to shield with me when we took the Frankish monastery of Saint-Omer? Have you forgotten what it means to be a son of Odin?" "I have forgotten nothing." Aldric's voice was dangerously quiet now, the kind of quiet that preceded the storm. "I remember the screams of the dying, the smell of burning thatch, the weight of responsibility for every life lost under my command. Perhaps that is the difference between us, brother. I learned from those memories, while you only hunger for more." It was then that I saw the final thread of brotherhood snap. Valdric's face went white, then red, as if he had been struck. When he spoke, his words were like chips of ice falling from a glacier's edge. "So be it, brother. Rule your kingdom of merchants and farmers. Build your walls of treaties and trade agreements, but do not come seeking the aid of warriors when those walls crumble beneath the axes of stronger men." With that, Valdric turned and strode from the hall, his cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a raven. Some of the younger warriors followed him, their faces grim with shared discontent. I watched them go and felt the chill touch of prophecy upon my heart, for I had heard the Norns loom, clicking in the darkness, weaving new patterns into the tapestry of fate. The coronation the next day proceeded as planned, but the joy had gone out of it. Aldric wore the ancient crown of his fathers, received the oaths of fealty from the assembled jarls, and spoke words of unity and prosperity that should have filled every heart with hope. Yet even as the people cheered their new king, eyes kept drifting to the empty space where the royal brother should have stood. Valdric had not fled the kingdom, but neither had he bent the knee. Instead, he had withdrawn to Ravensholm, a strong fortress on the kingdom's northern border that had been granted to him as his inheritance. There, surrounded by those warriors who shared his hunger for the old ways, he began to gather strength and wait for opportunity. The seasons turned, and for a time it seemed that peace might prevail. Aldric proved himself a capable ruler, negotiating favorable trade agreements with distant kingdoms, settling disputes between jarls with wisdom and fairness, and strengthening the kingdom's defenses through alliance rather than aggression. The people prospered, the harvests were bountiful, and ships laden with goods from across the known world filled the harbors. But in the north at Ravensholm, Valdric watched and waited. His followers spoke of the old ways being forgotten, of their warrior heritage being sold for foreign gold. They remembered the glory days of Thorvald's reign, when Viking longships struck fear into the hearts of enemies from Ireland to Constantinople. And slowly, carefully, Valdric began to weave a web of discontent that would soon entangle the entire kingdom. The end of that first year of Aldric's reign brought unusual omens. The winter was harsh beyond memory, with ice that froze the fjords solid and wolves that came down from the mountains to hunt in the very streets of the villages. The aurora danced in colors never before seen, deep purples and blood reds that the seeresses said spoke of great changes coming. And in the depths of that bitter winter, word came to the royal hall that changed everything. Danish longships had been seen massing in the waters to the south, their dragon-prowed vessels dark against the grey sea. King Sweyn Forkbeard himself was said to be among them, his eyes set upon the rich lands of Nordheim and his heart filled with the ambition to extend his own kingdom northward. When the news reached Aldric, he called together his council of war. The great hall filled with jarls and war chiefs, their faces grim in the torchlight as they debated strategy and prepared for the coming storm. But one voice was notably absent from their deliberations, that of Valdric, the kingdom's finest war leader and most experienced battle commander. The messengers who rode north to Ravensholm returned with word that chilled every heart. Prince Valdric would answer his king's call to war, but only if Aldric publicly acknowledged that his brother was the superior war leader and granted him command of the kingdom's entire military force. It was an impossible demand, one that would essentially divide the kingdom's power between two rulers. Aldric could not grant such authority without undermining his own kingship, yet without Valdric's military expertise and the loyalty of the warriors who followed him, the kingdom would face the Danish invasion weakened and divided. And so, as the winter storms lashed the coast and the Danish threat grew ever more real, the two brothers found themselves locked in a conflict that would soon escalate far beyond their ability to control. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of Midgard and call down the judgment of the gods themselves. The spring thaw came early that year, and with it came the Danish ships. They appeared on the horizon like a dark stain spreading across the sea, their black sails billowing in the wind and their dragon-headed prows cutting through the waves like the fangs of Jormungandr himself. From the watchtowers along the coast, horn calls echoed across the land, carrying the ancient warning that had not been heard for more than a generation. Ships, "Ships in the fjord! The enemy comes!" I stood upon the ramparts of the royal hall that morning, watching as the messenger hawks carried word to every corner of the kingdom. The smell of spring was in the air, melting snow, new growth, the promise of life returning to the land. But overshadowing it all was the metallic scent of approaching war. King Aldric stood beside me, his face carved from stone as he counted the enemy vessels. 50 longships at least, each carrying 40 warriors or more. The largest of them flew banners that marked them as belonging to Swine Forkbeard himself, the Danish king whose ambition had already swallowed half of England and now turned its hungry gaze northward to the unconquered fjords of Nordheim. 2,000 warriors, perhaps more, Aldric murmured, his hand unconsciously moving to rest upon the pommel of his father's sword. "And we can field—" "What? 800? 1,000 if we strip every village of its defenders?" "If we had the men of Ravensholm," I dared to speak what we both knew, "the numbers would be closer to even. Valdric commands 300 of our finest warriors." Aldric's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Below us, the courtyard of the hall had erupted into controlled chaos as servants and warriors prepared for siege. Weapons were sharpened, armor was checked and rechecked, and provisions were gathered in case the enemy managed to push inland from their beachhead. But even as these preparations continued, both king and chronicler knew that the kingdom's fate might well depend on a reconciliation that seemed increasingly impossible. Pride, that most dangerous of the gods' gifts to mortal men, had driven a wedge between the brothers that grew wider with each passing day. The Danish army made landfall 3 leagues south of the royal hall, on a wide beach that had once been used for the launching of Nordheim's own raiding fleets. They came ashore in good order, their shields locked and their spear points glinting in the morning sun. At their head rode Sweyn himself, a giant of a man whose red beard was streaked with grey and whose blue eyes held the cold intelligence of a born conqueror. From the hill above the beach, Aldric watched through the eyes of his scouts as the enemy began to make camp. Their discipline was impressive. Trenches were dug, palisades erected, sentries posted at all approaches. These were not wild raiders seeking quick plunder, but professional soldiers preparing for a campaign of conquest. "Your Majesty," said Hakon One-Eye, the grizzled war chief who had served Aldric's father for 30 years, "we cannot meet them on the beach. They outnumber us too greatly, and they have chosen their ground well. But if we can draw them inland, into the forests and narrow valleys where their numbers count for less, we need every warrior we can muster." Aldric replied, his voice heavy with the weight of command. "Send word once more to my brother. Tell him that the kingdom stands on the edge of a knife and that old grievances must be set aside in the face of this threat." The messenger who rode north to Ravensholm was Tormund the Swift, the same man who had carried word between the brothers throughout that bitter winter. He was known for his loyalty to the crown and his skill at finding the right words to cool hot tempers. If anyone could bridge the gap between the royal brothers, it would be he. But when Tormund returned 2 days later, his face was grim as storm clouds. The entire court gathered in the great hall to hear his report, their faces lit by the dancing flames of the central fire and shadowed by their fears for the kingdom's future. "I spoke with Prince Valdric," Tormund began, his voice carefully neutral. "He receives your summons, Your Majesty, and acknowledges the gravity of the threat we face, but his answer remains unchanged. He will bring his warriors to the kingdom's defense, but only if he is granted supreme command of all military forces." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles, some of anger, some of fear, some of grudging understanding. In the old days, before the crown had passed from father to son by right of primogeniture, such disputes had been settled by single combat, or by the judgment of the thing, the assembly of free men. But those days were long past, and the kingdom now faced the terrible choice between unity and principle. "Did he say nothing else?" Aldric asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "He said Tormund continued reluctantly, that a kingdom ruled by a weak king deserves to fall, but that strong warriors should not have to die for another man's failures. He said that if you truly loved your people, you would step aside and allow a stronger hand to guide them through this crisis. The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and outrage through the assembled court. Several of the younger jarls reached for their weapons, their loyalty to their king burning bright despite their fear of the coming battle. But Aldrich raised his hand for silence, his face pale but his voice steady. "My brother speaks of strength, but he mistakes stubbornness for wisdom. I am king by right of birth and by our father's will. I will not trade the crown for a temporary alliance, even with the Danes at our gates." "Then the Danes will find us divided," said Jarl Erika of the Western Isles, one of the more pragmatic members of the council. "And a divided kingdom cannot stand against Sweyn Forkbeard. Perhaps some compromise might be found." "What compromise?" Aldrich's voice carried a bitter edge. "Valdric demands supreme command of all forces. Such authority would make him king in all but name. Should I rule over merchants and farmers while my brother commands the loyalty of every warrior in the realm?" It was then that Ragnhild the Wise, the ancient seeress who had advised 3 kings before Aldrich, spoke from her place beside the fire. Her voice was like wind through autumn leaves, carrying the weight of prophecy and the chill of fate. "I have cast the runes, young king, and read the signs in the flight of ravens. The Norns weave a dark pattern, shot through with threads of betrayal and blood. Brother will face brother beneath the watching eyes of gods, and the price of ambition will be paid in full." Her words sent a shiver through every soul in the hall, for Ragnhild's prophecies had never yet proven false. But prophecy, like the wind, could only warn of the storm's approach. It could not turn aside the lightning when it finally chose to strike. The Danish attack came at dawn of the 3rd day, just as the morning mist began to lift from the fjord. They advanced in 3 columns, their shields locked and their war songs echoing across the valley. At their center marched Sweyn himself, his great axe glinting in the pale sunlight and his voice rising above the din of battle like the roar of a wounded bear. Aldrich met them at the Thornwood, a dense forest that lay between the enemy landing and the populated heart of the kingdom. He had chosen his ground carefully. Here, the Danish advantage in numbers would count for less, and the narrow paths would break up their disciplined formations. The battle began with a flight of arrows that darkened the sky like a flock of ravens. Danish shafts hissed through the morning air to strike against the shields of Nordheim's defenders, while the kingdom's archers sent their own deadly replies back into the ranks of the invaders. Then came the clash of shield walls that sound like thunder that every warrior knows and dreads. The crash of wood against wood, iron against iron, the grunts and curses of men straining against their enemy's strength. In that first collision, good men died on both sides, their blood soaking into the earth that would soon drink much more deeply. I fought in that battle, though my place was officially as chronicler rather than warrior. But when the kingdom stands in peril, every hand must hold a weapon, and I wielded my father's sword with what skill, age, and experience had given me. Around me, the men of Nordheim fought with the desperate courage of those who defend their homes and families. Yet from the beginning, it was clear that courage alone would not be enough. The Danes were too many, too well trained, too disciplined in their advance. Slowly but steadily, they pushed the defenders back through the forest, leaving behind them a trail of broken shields and fallen warriors. It was in the midst of that desperate struggle that the horn call echoed across the battlefield, 3 long blasts that made every fighter pause in wonder. From the north came the sound of hoofbeats and war cries, and suddenly the trees seemed to part to admit a column of mounted warriors whose battle standards bore the Raven of Ravensholm. Veldrick had come at last, He rode at the head of his men, like one of the old gods come to wage war upon the earth. His dark hair streamed behind him, his green eyes burned with battle fury, and his sword swept in deadly arcs that left Danish warriors falling like wheat before the scythe. Behind him came the finest fighters in the kingdom, men who had followed him through a dozen battles and would follow him through the gates of hell itself. The arrival of the Ravensholm warriors turned the tide of battle in an instant. Caught between Aldric's beleaguered forces and Valdric's fresh troops, the Danish advance stalled and then began to crumble. Swine Forkbeard himself was forced to fight his way back toward the coast, his great axe carving a path through the chaos as his men fell around him. But even in that moment of triumph, I saw the seeds of future tragedy. Valdric fought like a man possessed, as if trying to prove through deed what words had failed to accomplish. Every Danish warrior who fell to his blade was an argument for his worthiness, every enemy driven back a vindication of his claim to leadership. And when the battle was finally won, when the surviving Danes had limped back to their ships and sailed away with their tails between their legs, it was to Valdric that the warriors raised their voices in celebration. It was Valdric they carried on their shoulders, Valdric whose name they chanted as the sun set over the battlefield strewn with enemy dead. Aldric watched it all from the edge of the forest, his face unreadable in the dying light. He had won a great victory. The kingdom was saved, the Danish threat turned aside, the people secured in their homes for another generation. But the cost of that victory was becoming clear. His brother's star had risen while his own had dimmed, and the loyalty of the warriors, the very foundation of royal power, was shifting like sand beneath his feet. That night, as the army made camp among the trees of Thornwood, the two brothers met for what would prove to be the last time as allies. They stood together beside a small fire, away from the celebration that filled the forest with song and laughter. "You came," Aldric said simply. "Despite everything, you came when the kingdom needed you." Valdric's smile was sharp as a blade's edge. "I came to protect our people, not to serve a weak king. Today's victory proves what I have always known, that strength, not pretty words, determines the fate of kingdoms." "The victory was ours together," Aldric replied, though his voice carried little conviction. "Your arrival turned the tide, true enough, but it was my strategy that chose the ground, my preparations that made the victory possible." "Your strategy?" Valdric's voice rose, causing several nearby warriors to look in their direction. "Your strategy would have seen us all dead if I had not arrived when I did. The men know this, brother. They know who saved them and who would have led them to slaughter." And it was then that the final, fatal words were spoken, words that would echo through the halls of the gods and shake the very foundations of the 9 worlds. "The kingdom needs a king who can inspire as well as plan," Valdric continued, his voice growing cold as winter wind. "It needs a ruler who understands that sometimes the only choice is to fight, and who has the strength to make hard decisions when soft options have failed. And you believe you are that man." Aldric's own temper began to kindle, fed by days of stress and the bitter knowledge that his brother might be right. "I know I am that man. The warriors who followed me today know it. Even the Jarls who still pay lip service to your rule know it in their hearts. The only one who refuses to see the truth is you." They stared at each other across the firelight, two brothers who had once shared everything, childhood adventures, warrior training, dreams of glory and service to their people. Now they stood divided by ambition and pride, by competing visions of what leadership meant and what the kingdom required. "If you truly believe that," Aldric said at last, his voice deadly quiet, "then let the gods decide between us. The old law still stands. Trial by combat to determine who has the right to rule. Tomorrow, at dawn, on the high field above the fjord, let sword and shield settle what words cannot." The challenge hung in the air between them like the blade of fate itself. Around the forest, the celebration continued, but some primal instinct had warned the warriors that something momentous was happening. Gradually, the singing died away and a circle of watchers formed around the two princes. Valdric's eyes glittered in the firelight, and for a moment I thought he might refuse, might step back from the precipice that yawned before them both. But pride, that destroyer of kingdoms and slayer of brothers, had sunk its claws too deeply into his heart. "So be it," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every ear in the forest. "Let the gods judge which of us is worthy to rule. But when your blood waters the earth tomorrow, brother, do not curse me for giving you the death of a warrior rather than the slow decay of a failed king." The words were formal acceptance of the challenge, spoken in the ancient formula that made the duel not just personal combat, but a sacred trial. Once spoken, they could not be taken back. The gods themselves would be watching, and their judgment would be final. That night, neither brother slept. Aldrich spent the dark hours in prayer and meditation, seeking the favor of the gods and the clarity that would steady his sword arm when the moment of truth arrived. Valdric walked the perimeter of the camp like a restless wolf, his thoughts dark and his heart heavy with the weight of choices that could no longer be unmade. As chronicler of the hall and keeper of its memory, I should have tried to prevent what was to come. I should have sought out wise counselors who might have mediated between the brothers, or found some compromise that would have preserved both their lives and the kingdom's unity. But prophecy had spoken through Ragnhild's lips, and I knew in my heart that the Norns had already woven this moment into the tapestry of fate. When dawn came, it came grey and cold, with mist rising from the fjord and the cry of ravens echoing across the water. The high field above the royal hall had been cleared, and a circle marked out in accordance with the ancient laws. Every warrior who could walk had come to witness the trial, along with jarls and their retainers, farmers and fishermen, women and children, all the people whose future would be decided by the outcome of this single combat. The brothers armed themselves with ceremony befitting such a momentous occasion. Aldrich wore the mail shirt that had belonged to their grandfather, its rings bright with polish and blessed by the high priest of Odin. His shield bore the royal arms, a golden dragon on a field of blue, and his sword was the ancient blade Kinslayer, forged by dwarfsmiths in the first days of the world. Valdric chose simpler gear, but no less deadly. His mail was black as night, his shield painted with a silver wolf, and his weapon was the sword, Blood Drinker, won in single combat from a Danish champion 3 summers past. Where his brother looked every inch a king, Valdric appeared as what he was, a warrior born and bred, shaped by battle and hardened by conflict. They met in the center of the circle as the sun broke through the morning clouds, its light casting their shadows long across the trampled grass. For a moment they stood face to face without speaking, and I saw in their eyes the memory of childhood games, shared adventures, and the love that had once bound them closer than shield brothers. Then the horns sounded, and the time for memory passed. The duel began cautiously, each brother testing the other's defenses with careful thrusts and measured attacks. They knew each other's fighting style intimately, had trained together since childhood, had fought side by side in countless battles. Each knew the other's strengths and weaknesses as well as his own, but gradually the combat intensified. Valdric's speed and aggression began to tell against Aldric's more defensive approach. The younger brother pressed forward with a series of lightning attacks that drove his opponent back across the circle, his blade weaving patterns of steel that glittered in the morning light. Aldrich gave ground reluctantly, his shield taking blow after blow as he sought an opening for a decisive counterattack. His breathing grew labored, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The weight of the crown, it seemed, was no match for the fire of desperate ambition. It was then that fate played its cruelest hand. As Aldrich stepped back to avoid a particularly vicious thrust, his heel caught in a rabbit hole hidden in the grass. He stumbled, his guard dropping for just an instant, and Valdric's blade was there, sliding between the rings of royal mail to pierce the heart that had once loved him above all others. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. Aldrich looked down at his brother's sword protruding from his chest, then up into Valdric's eyes. What he saw there, triumph mixed with horror, Satisfaction, tainted by the first bitter taste of regret, would haunt the younger prince for the rest of his very short life. "I'm sorry," Valdric whispered, so quietly that only Aldrich could hear. "I never meant, I only wanted—" But Aldrich was beyond hearing. The light faded from his eyes, and he fell backward onto the grass that would soon run red with royal blood. The golden dragon on his shield caught the sunlight one last time, then was still forever. A great silence fell over the gathered crowd, broken only by the sound of wind through the grass and the distant cry of seabirds. Valdric stood over his brother's body, the bloody sword still in his hand, and for the first time seemed to truly understand what he had done. He had won. The trial by combat was concluded, the gods had rendered their judgment, and he was now king by right of conquest as well as birth. But the taste of victory was as bitter as wormwood in his mouth, and the crown that was now his seemed to weigh heavier than the mountains themselves. It was then that the sky began to darken, though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. Clouds gathered with unnatural speed, boiling up from the horizon like smoke from a great fire. The wind rose to a howl that seemed to carry voices, the voices of gods and giants, of the honored dead, and the powers that ruled beyond the edge of the world. And in that wind, carried on wings of flame and shadow, came the dragons. 10 years have passed since the gods descended to judge the sins of men, and I, Hjalmar the Chronicler, have grown old in the writing of this tale. My hand shakes now as I form these final words, but my memory remains clear as mountain ice, preserving every detail of that day when the natural order was overturned. The kingdom of Nordheim endures, though changed forever by what transpired on the high field above the fjord. Valdric never claimed the crown he had won through bloodshed. How could he, when his brother's death brought down the wrath of heaven itself? Instead, he disappeared into the northern wastes, some say riding the great dragon that had chosen him, seeking redemption in lands beyond the edge of the world. In his place, the Jarls chose Aldric's young son to rule, with a council of regents to guide the kingdom until the boy came of age. The child bears his father's name and his grandfather's wisdom, and under his rule, though he knows it not, the dragons still watch from their mountain caves, guardians now rather than judges. Sometimes, on clear winter nights when the aurora dances across the sky, the people say they can see shapes moving among the lights, a golden dragon bearing a crowned rider, flying eternal patrol over the lands he died defending. And sometimes, though more rarely, they glimpse a second dragon, black as night, carrying a figure bent with remorse, who will never know peace until the world's end and begin anew. But perhaps the most remarkable change is in the hearts of the people themselves. The tale of the Dragon Kings has spread to every corner of the northern lands, carried by skalds and sung in great halls from Ireland to the Russ. It has become more than history, it has become legend, a reminder that the gods still watch over Midgard, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, is never denied. And so I end this chronicle, the last testament of one who witnessed the impossible and lived to tell the tale. Let those who come after remember that the bonds of blood are sacred, that ambition unchecked destroys both victor and victim, and that sometimes the dead serve the living better than the living serve themselves. The dragons sleep now in their mountain halls, but they do not slumber deeply, and should the need arise, should brother again raise sword against brother, should the innocent cry out for justice, should the natural order itself come under threat, they will wake and the sky will burn with the righteous fire of divine judgment. This is the tale of the Viking who fell by his brother's hand, and of the dragons who arose to judge the betrayer. May it serve as warning to the ambitious and comfort to the wronged, until the end of days and the twilight of the gods. Thus ends the Chronicle of the Dragon Kings, as witnessed and recorded by Hjalmar the Chronicler, keeper of memory, in the 10th year after the judgment of heaven. Thank you for joining us on this epic journey through Norse legend and divine justice. If you enjoyed this tale of brotherhood, betrayal, and supernatural judgment, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories from the world of Viking mythology. Don't forget to comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our global community of mythology enthusiasts. Until next time, may the gods watch over your journey.